Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa Plaggemier, the Executive Director of the National Cybersecurity Alliance, and I'm here today with Josh Margolin. He is the writer and director of the new movie Thelma, which is based on a true story, embellished a bit for comedic effect. But thanks for talking with me today, Josh.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about the impetus to do this. Like, what was the true story, and how did this all unfold? How did you get to the point where you have a family member who was scammed to the point now where you're talking about a movie?
Sure. Well, basically, my grandma, whose name is Thelma, got a. I think she'd actually gotten one of these scam calls in the past and sort of was able to make sense of it before she kind of got on board. But she got a call at one point where someone was pretending to be me, saying they had been in a car accident of some kind, they had a broken nose, they needed to be bailed out of jail, not to contact my parents. And it just got under her skin and she got freaked out and started trying to sort of put things in motion to get me out of there. And then my parents got panicked as well. I think she was so convinced that it was me that they got convinced and no one could reach me at the time. So things kind of spiraled for a little bit. And then luckily in real life, we were able to intervene before she actually sent the money because they were able to reach me. My partner, Chloe, got a call from them. She said, "Is everything okay?" And they said, "No, Josh is in jail." She said, "No, he's not. He's asleep." And so that put an end to it, thankfully. But that the incident and the fact that it kind of got as far as it got just got me thinking about my grandma and that the moment in life she was in where she was living alone for the first time in 70 plus years after living with, or maybe kind of ever actually, because she lived with her parents and she lived with my grandpa, her husband for 70 years or so. Um, and I just, there was something kind of unnerving about her living alone at that moment and getting taken advantage of and getting so panicked. And so I started imagining, well, what might have happened if she had sent the money, and then set out to get it back, which became the impetus for the script and for the idea, and got me excited to start writing it. But it was, yeah, a mix of sort of an excuse to write an ode to her grit and her tenacity and her spirit and just her, who, someone I've always admired and been really close to it and and looked up to, and also kind of, yeah, exploring that moment of being that age and kind of in some ways relishing that autonomy a little bit, but also starting to slow down in some ways and needing some help, but also really not wanting it, and just how she navigated that balance, and how kind of at many phases in life we all navigate that balance in different ways. So that was sort of the moment and the incident and the thoughts that came after that got me started on the movie.
So tell me a little bit more about that moment where she reached out to your parents first. Was she reaching out saying, "I need to do something about this"? And so how did that transpire that they got a little stressed out about it too, and everybody was kind of believing it for more than a minute or
I
two?
think she called them, even though she was told not to by me. I think she called them just because she was panicked and she wanted to know if they had talked to me. And they couldn't reach me because I was, asleep at the time, sleeping in a little bit at that time. So I believe she called them to just say, "Hey, this thing is happening. Have you talked to Josh?" And they had not, and they tried me. They couldn't reach me at first, and so it just sort of further solidified the narrative she was in, that I was in some kind
Right.
of trouble.
When did they realize that this was probably a scam?
I think
Your
one
parents,
reached me, honestly. I think once I
really?
was able to kind of get on the phone, I think my parents, and I wish I sort of knew the exact play by play there. But my sense of it was, I think my mom got pretty concerned quickly because, she knows that her mom and knows me very well, and that she had gotten these calls before. And the fact that this one she thought was real, I think just it felt like kind of wrong place, wrong time, or just everybody was kind of ready to be worried about it because she was so worried about it and they went along with that. And my dad, I think, was like a little more skeptical, but even so, he was wanting to make sure. I think everybody was in a place where they were not sure. Anywhere from like pretty concerned to just not totally clear on what was happening and wanted to get in touch with me before, anything else.
Yeah, so it's more out of concern for you and less out of like suspicion that this was something scammy.
I
Um,
think so. I think
it
there
was
was a little awareness of that possibility, but mostly in this instance, it was driven by
the
concern
emotion.
and wanting to make sure I was okay and just worry for my well-being.
Right, right. Um, so how did your grandmother feel about talking about it sort of publicly, or her story becoming very public, or your parents for that matter?
It's a good question. It was something that I wondered about myself in working on this, and obviously so much of it does become fictionalized while kind of carrying a lot of the threads of what was very true throughout it. But I think my grandma, when I first told her about the idea, I think her first impression was just sort of like, okay, well, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, you're gonna have to come up with a movie about it. Not that much happened. Like kind of playing it down a little bit, and also just thinking about the fact that, like, in her mind, that story, it was a moment, but it wasn't a story.
Story.
And then for me, from my vantage point, it felt like the beginning of a story. Um, and I think overall, it's funny when she talks about that incident, the story kind of changes a little bit over the years when she tells it, because I think sometimes she also, I mean, she just turned 104 2 days ago. So
Good for her.
yeah, she's doing pretty good, all things considered. She's hanging in, but there was an incident, there was this earlier incident where she caught the guy, where she was on it, where she caught on. And so sometimes in the retelling, those kind of bleed together a little bit, I think, in terms of, and I think it makes sense because I think it also is a little bit of a vulnerable thing to be like, I got tricked or I got taken advantage of in some way. And it would have been even more so if it had actually gone as far as it, if she'd sent the money. Um, so I think the fact that she didn't, and same for my parents, the fact that it did stop, I think let them all be able to look at it with a little more of like, oh, that was crazy, or like, what a crazy incident, as opposed to something so shameful, where they'd be embarrassed to talk about it. But even I think for my grandma, especially in the way that those stories tend to bleed together more and more, I think there is a little bit of resistance to the idea that she fully went along with it. I think the story kind of, as she tells it, gets a little more like, well, I knew, or then for a moment I didn't, and just slightly sanded down
Yeah.
from what I think it was originally. So they've both been pretty good about talking about it, but also I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it didn't, it didn't get worse.
Can't lose any money.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. I think if they had, it would be a much, just a harder thing to admit to, in the same way, or to talk about honestly.
Yeah, that's something that we see every day. And
Yeah.
the reality is, the less that the fewer victims that discuss what happened to them, the fewer people come forward to talk about it, the more the bad guys win.
Right.
Because there's just not enough awareness about it. But I have seen, I mean, I remember years ago when my mom fell for a tech support scam and I uncovered it and was annoyed. Just as an adult child, as before I worked in cybersecurity, and just like, oh man, like how could this happen? How could
Right.
you not know better? And then
Right.
fast forward, that was, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, and my aunt fell for a scam. Luckily, it happened on late on a Friday afternoon, and she was able to keep the money transfer from going through. Like she called her bank right away. And she
That's
kind of realized what had happened pretty quickly. She clicked probably on a phishing email. Somebody had like this pop-up that came up on her screen saying there's something wrong with your computer, call this number. She called the number, also a form of a tech support scam.
yeah.
And when she told me, I had incredible empathy. My husband and I happened to be visiting, and so we, made sure that her ran a couple different antivirus programs and made sure her antivirus on her laptop was up to date. But this was like a day or two after it had happened. On the day that it happened, she told my adult cousins, and it was like Easter dinner or something. It was a family gathering, and she told them about it, and they shamed her to the point where she went to the room and cried.
Huh.
And I just think the more that happens, the more the bad guys win. So that's really the key. You mentioned that she hadn't lived alone, practically ever.
Yeah.
And loneliness plays a huge role in vulnerability for things like this, especially with elder scams and fraud.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, any comments about like that emotional vulnerability of loneliness or any other way she might have been vulnerable to something like this?
It's interesting. I think that, it was in the wake of my grandpa passing away, and she was living alone for the first time. And I think it really was for her, obviously a great loss, and there was a lot of mourning that she was experiencing. But I do also think there was, as time went on, something that she enjoyed about having a space to herself, just because she'd never had that in her whole life. And she's such a, kind of independent person in so many ways, and someone who kind of, is in charge of her own life, even though she wasn't always alone in that. So I think it was kind of a double-edged sword for her, I think, of like there was loneliness at play, there was some vulnerability there, but I think there was also this newfound kind of ownership of her space in a way that she hadn't had. So it's interesting about the loneliness thing, because I think that it's certainly part of the DNA of it, but for her, but I don't know that it was like, it's hard to tell if that was the primary driver, or if it was like, just in the way that she was kind of not expecting this at whatever that moment was, and at an age where her instinct to sort of slow down and question it just wasn't. I think it was just still pretty foreign to her, even though she had gotten a call like this maybe once before. The idea that this would happen, the idea this would happen multiple times, the idea that this was just something to contend with, I think was not, kind of to your point, and how it wasn't discussed all that frequently. It wasn't just on her radar readily. And so I do think for whatever reason, that first line, that first delivery sounded enough like me on the phone that she just kind of, something activated in her, some panic. But I do think, again, being alone, being not surrounded by people at the time, there's the cross-checking process happened, but it happened through phone calls and through something a little more elongated, as opposed to being able to kind of double check that in the moment, in real time, in person. Um, but I'm sure
But
your family was very happy to have somebody who's an expert in cybersecurity around.
well, I tell you, I'm trying to constantly keep my mom out of trouble on the internet, and
Yes, I'm sure.
her sort of baked in vulnerability is that she's just really determined to keep up with technology and to use it. And that's for somebody who's 82,
Yeah.
that's a huge challenge. And, I was at her place, retirement community, the independent living place a couple of weeks ago. And I'm trying to explain dark patterns to her on the internet, and how like even very reputable websites will do things to try and get you to buy more, shop more, click here. Not to mention the malicious stuff that's out there. There's a lot of legitimate advertising that's not good, and
Right.
UX UI design that's not great if you're 82 and can't figure out what's an ad and what's not, and what you
Yeah.
should. Can I just get onto this e-commerce site and bought what I came here for without, just sort of being bombarded? And I was trying to explain dark patterns, and my dad's sitting in the other side of the room, and he said, Jan, it's like mind control. I was like, okay.
There you go.
If that worked for them at their age to think of it that way, that's
Exactly.
like we're
It's
just
like,
being so manipulated. If you watch the social dilemma during COVID about social media and all these things that are trying to keep us online, and the dopamine hits to our brain every time we, click purchase or whatever it is. It's just such a challenge for somebody who's got, maybe starting to have some issues with clarity of mind,
yeah,
and just the not having grown up with it and not being naturally skeptical of it.
right.
Um, it kind of feels like maybe the equivalent for them was walking through some fair and listening to all the carnival barkers and or yellow journalism at the time, like the scathing headlines in the newspaper that were just kind of there to get your attention and evoke an emotional response.
Yeah, I know
Um,
my grandma similarly is very like, she uses quite a bit of technology still. And she did through her 90s. She was, she did her own email, she texts,
Well,
she FaceTimes, she still does, and she has an Instagram that she just uses to kind of scroll. But I will say, to your point, she definitely, her relationship to it is, she has like, there's some understanding of her, of how to navigate it, I guess. Like she's kind of memorized some of these patterns of how to kind of do stuff, but the she's moving through a ecosystem she also does not totally
mm,
understand. So it doesn't take much. And it's ironic that I guess this was just a phone call, the actual scam, but for the amount of time she spends on her devices too, she's kind of making her way through, but not with skepticism or with sort of a fundamental understanding of what she's moving through. Not that I
right.
would even claim I always necessarily would have a quote unquote fundamental understanding of what I'm doing, but I do think there is this kind of like broad strokes way of navigating it that feels like it would be so easy to accidentally click on this thing and order this thing or sign up for the, it's
Right.
easy to imagine that happening because she is also somebody who tries to keep up with that stuff. Not because she even likes it that much, but I think she thinks of it as her way of staying in touch with people who aren't around, with family and friends and, people around across the country.
Through that lens, then, what do you think we need to be doing as a society or as technology providers or organizations like us that are trying to help people and get the message to them before something bad happens? Just from your vantage point, and I realize you're not employed by big tech and you didn't
I am not.
coding. Um, but is it telling more of these stories? Is it, your specialty is connecting with people through movies, and so is it telling more stories? Is it, you know regulation? Is it, big tech thinking more about this demographic and their struggles with these things? I mean, I think about AI, and things like what happened to
Yeah.
your grandmother are just going to get harder and harder to decipher the more the bad guys lean into using AI. So videos like we're doing right now, we're hearing a lot of phishing attempts, if you will, through videos that are AI generated, where you think you're talking live to somebody and basically they're just a puppet on the screen and somebody else is doing all the talking, but the voice that's coming out is that actually, AI generated to be the same as the real person's voice. So it's just going to get harder and harder.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
any
the
thoughts kind of about the state of things and what do we do about it?
yeah, it feels like a very important question and one that I certainly don't feel qualified to say I know the answer to, but what I'll say is that I think it kind of feels twofold to me. I think one of the ways in which I hope things like even just this, grandparent scam or something that tried and true can be a little less surprising or taboo to discuss or sort of tucked away would be telling stories about them and would be just making these things known, making it known that these exist, whether it's through, movies or TV or news or articles, whatever it might be, just raising the signal and letting people know how common it is to sort of remove a little bit of the shame from the equation. Because I hear you when you say that so many people don't report this kind of stuff because it feels embarrassing. It feels like it admits they are not capable in some way that they're wanting to, not display. And I think the flip side of that is that every person we talk to about this movie, either they themselves or a family member has had an experience like this. So it's clearly so widespread and touches everybody. And it's almost like if you could get enough people to just go like, yeah, this is a thing. This happens. Sometimes, they prey on your emotions. It catches you on a day when you're just not at your most defensive, and there you go. It's as opposed to looking at that as a shameful thing, just sort of finding a way to showcase data that it's very natural and very human and something that happens to everybody. And I think the second part of that is what you were talking about, which is that it's going to, with the AI stuff, deep fake stuff, all that, it just feels like it's going to get so much worse and so much harder to discern, not just for older people. That's the thing. I think it's in kind of all of our interest that we prick up to these trends and the capacity for deceit, I suppose, in that new tech. And I wish I had a sense of, what the best protections would be or what the best way to, whether it is regulation or awareness or however that might work. I can't say I have a very well thought out answer on that as of yet, but I I do think there's something to the idea of realizing this is also not just a problem that's affecting senior citizens or people who we
Yeah.
typically tend to think of as, well, they have their issues and I don't need to think about those. Like already that's there's weird things about that outlook, but I think it's easy to kind of put things away that you feel you don't have to deal with yet. And I do think realizing how this is actually creeping toward all of us and something we all need to kind of become aware of and realize the capacity for is really valuable.
Yeah, believe it or not, our data shows that younger people tend to get compromised in some way that costs them their data or their money most frequently.
Really?
Um, yeah, and they feel kind of the most resigned to like, oh well, this is just how the internet is. Like bad things are going to
Oh,
happen.
that's
Um,
interesting. I didn't realize that it was, I guess the
but
ratio.
actually,
Oh, go ahead.
older people, when they get scammed for the highest dollar amounts because the bad guys are going to go where the money is, and you're
Right.
talking about people with their life savings. So they're far more devastating when it happens to the aging population than it is when it happens to somebody who's just out of college and doesn't have a whole lot going on in their bank account yet.
Right.
Um,
But
yeah,
even
that's
so,
that's
that's interesting. I didn't realize
yeah.
that.
Um,
Wow.
the other thing that we advocate for is that aside from just raising awareness on these types of scams, is some of the behaviors that people can do to prevent these things. So one of my sort of pet peeves is that a lot of our social media accounts aren't protected with multi-factor authentication. The social media organizations, most of them don't enable it by default, or they don't require it like our banks do at this point.
Right.
You can't log in onto most bank accounts without it. And if you can, you should probably get another bank.
Right. That's a red flag.
Because there's so many attacks that happen like this through compromised social media accounts or fake social media accounts. So my aunt, for example, has had her Facebook account taken over multiple times, probably because she was using a weak password or a password that's for sale on the dark web or is easy to crack or whatever. And then they use those social media accounts that they've compromised to then communicate with other people and attack other people that might be in her friends group or whatever.
Oh,
So I
wow.
think,
They take it out,
um,
they like get into her real account and then start using it nefariously.
yeah, exactly. And that can be really hard. So think about, like you mentioned that, your grandmother just lost her husband of many, many years. Bad guys are reading obituaries. Bad guys are reading your profile.
Right.
If all that stuff is public, where you went to school, I might pop up on a social media after you've just had the loss of a spouse saying, oh, hey, it's me, your old friend from school, right? And trying to develop a relationship. And those relationships can turn into crypto scams, which is part of pig butchering, if you've heard of that.
Haven't
Romance
actually.
scams, just any kind of friend scam, like anything where they're like building up trust over time. Those are
Yeah.
long games where they take months and months to build that relationship, and before you know it, you've transferred them money. But to your point that anybody can fall for this, and just talking about vulnerabilities, we're all human, we're all vulnerable, and there's always a moment where we're moving too fast or we're emotionally vulnerable to something like this. The US Secret Service has a video with a victim of a romance scam who was an attorney, like super well-spoken, educated woman, but she had just been through a divorce and was fighting cancer. And so she was and sometimes we talk about those things very openly on social media and post them in ways that anybody can see. And
Right.
so that's a little bit of calling card for the bad guys.
I know it's sad that something that can theoretically have this, upside, I suppose, of connectivity and sharing and vulnerability and being able to bring people together is also such a sort of a breeding ground for cons.
Right,
And,
right.
the more you of yourself you put out there in that way, it's like, it's sadly risky in that way because you're just exposing your most,
Yeah,
your most personal things, I guess.
right.
That's interesting. That's so upsetting that somebody would do that, but I suppose, of course they would.
Yeah, it happens far too often. So I've been talking today to Josh Margolin, the writer and director of the movie Thelma. Josh, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for inviting us to collaborate with you a little bit on promoting the movie and raising awareness for these types of scams. And hats off to your grandmother and your parents for being comfortable with you doing this, telling this story. It's really, really important to hear more of these stories to kind of normalize this and get rid of the guilt and shame in this situation. So thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for doing what you guys do. And yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.